So, good afternoon, everybody. We will continue the lecture about internal migration. And again, my camera here is not working. It might start working in the middle of the lecture. There were some questions here from students about exam 3, that the overall grade was worse than exams 1 and 2. I think because of the questions related to standardization in mortality and also life tables, those questions, they tend to be harder. And but that's it. I mean, I already made that exam kind of like easier by having fewer questions, 40 questions, as we have been having since the beginning of the semester. In the past, I used to have 50 questions. And we also have the 6 extra points. And if you look in the last column on Canvas, your total percentage points, the total percentage points, the denominator, it's not all the possible points that we're gonna have in this class. It's up to now. So up to now, we had 3 exams that they add up to 60 points, plus 13 quizzes, so 73, plus the assignment, 73, 74. So that's the denominator. But the assignment, I gave 2 extra points in the assignment, as you know. And so actually you could have gotten up to now up to 76 points out of 74. So you technically, students could have gotten more than 100% in the last column of Canvas. And so taking into account all the points that we're gonna have here and extra points, your maximum extra points in this class could be 106%. But I just wanted to highlight that the points that you have there now, it's not considering the remaining quizzes and the final exam in the denominator, right? It's just the denominator is up to now. And as I explained, 74 points, but in the numerator, you could have gotten up to 76 because of the 2 extra points in assignment 1. And with assignment 2, it's gonna be 79 in the numerator and 75 in the denominator, right? So that's all how the points work. But it's all automatically calculated by Canvas that way.
Is the final exam cumulative, or is it just over?
Yeah, no, the final exam is not cumulative, so it's gonna be just about the last 5 classes that we have in these last 3 weeks. So it's going to start from whatever I covered today on internal migration, and probably we're going to reach only until international migration, right? So it's not that different from what you guys had so far on exams 1, 2, and 3. Is that all clear? Any questions from home? So pretty much the overall grades on exam 3, as you know, you get this information on Canvas, was worse than 1 and 2. So just be careful by taking quizzes and by doing a good job on the assignments, because the assignments, each one of them give 2 extra points. And a lot of people that do not attend Zoom and do not come to class, of course, some people watch this lecture also on YouTube, and the views on YouTube increased a lot prior to the previous exam. But a lot of people that they are just taking the exams, they are missing quizzes, and the quizzes, they are 20% of the grade, so it's really important, right? And there is no more extra points besides the 6 extra points that are divided between the 3 assignments, okay? Cool. So the next topic here on internal migration lectures about measures of migration. I did rearrange a little bit here the slides, and I added one more slide and made some little changes. So you should download it again. Just because when I was talking about the approximate determinants of migration, I just moved the graphs right here just to be easy to understand how that those different ways in which migration rates they behave by age are associated exactly to these approximate determinants of migration. And I also added a slide here on the measures of migration that I will pass through in this class today. So there are some difficulties measuring migration that are not encountering when we do analysis of fertility and mortality. Births and deaths, they are usually registered at the time of when they happen, even if someone registered the baby a couple of days after the baby was born, or the relatives register the death of a relative a couple of days after the death. Usually the dates tend to be more accurate about when the birth or the death happened. And in most countries, the residential move of a person is not registered at exactly the time that the person moved within the country. There are some specific countries in which people are required to register with the government when they move. And that's the case of China and some Scandinavian countries. And in China, I mentioned to you, and it's the last portion of this chapter that we're not going to go in detail, but China, people who move within the country, they need to have a permit from the government. And there is a lot of migration from rural to urban areas of people trying to get better jobs and improve their lives. But if they don't get the approval from the government to move from rural to urban areas, they will not have access to public services when in the area of destination. And moreover, workers will not be able to enter in the formal labor market. So we have to get jobs in the formal labor market, which has worse salaries. So because of that, a lot of these migrants that don't get the approval from the government, they move without their children and other relatives, because their children will have access to public school only in their current place of residence. For example, a rural area here, as I'm talking about. But these people, they move because even if only being able to access to have informal jobs in the informal labor market, they will still think that they will have a better life in that area of destination. So even in China, in which it's required by the government for people to say that they are moving within the country, a lot of people move within China without the approval from the government. So a lot of people are not being counted. So it's just to show you that even for a country that has all this surveillance over its population, is still measuring migration is not an easy task. So it is usually necessary to rely on other types of data. And I'm going to talk about migration information is usually captured from census, decennial censuses, from surveys, and even here in the US, you can measure migration with income tax information, right? Because we don't have this registration system in which you tell the government exactly which day you moved. So which kind of data do we have here in the US to measure migration, and more specifically here, internal migration? The American Community Survey uses two items that they tend to be, in the past, they were part of the decennial censuses. And these two questions are related to the state of birth of the person. So we asked the person where you were born, which state you were born. And for people who were not born in the US, they answered which country they were born. So that question also can capture international migration. But then in the American Community Survey, it's also asked to the person, what's the place of residence that person used to be exactly 1 year before the ACS. And you remember that the reference date in the US for the census and for ACS is April 1st. In the US, we call it the census day, April 1st. So in the 2019 ACS, when people get into a specific household that was selected for that sample, they ask about all the people in that household. Where were you living exactly on April 1st, 2018? So we know where they are now in 2019, and then we ask the question about where they were in 2018. If the person exactly on April 1st, 2018 was living in College Station, and then that person moved somewhere else within this year, and then came back to College Station, that person is going to be a non-migrant. We are going to lose this migration stage in between these months, within this year. And this question about place of residence 1 year prior to the ACS used to be part of the census as well. I have already told you here before, up to the 2000 census, up to the 2000 decennial census, we had two versions of the questionnaire for this decennial census. A short form that we still had in 2010, and now this last year in 2020, but we had the long form. The short form is supposed to be answered by everybody in the population in the decennial census. So it's really a census because everybody's answering that questionnaire. The long form contained more questions, and it was implemented only for a sample of the population. It was usually around 5% of the households in the US. But then, starting 2010, the decennial census does not have the long form anymore, only the short form. In the short form, there is no information about migration. And how was the information about migration used to be asked in the long form of the census, only up to the 2000 census. It was, where was the place of the residence of the person exactly 5 years before the census day. So in 2000, it was asked, where you know where the person is living now on April 1st, 2000, and the person was asked, where did you live? In which place did you live? In which city, county did you live? Exactly 5 years ago, on April 1st, 1995, right? So this question of a place of residence in a fixed prior date, it was asked up to the 2000 census, 5 years before the census. So the 1990 also has it, 1980 as well, 1970. But the 2010 census doesn't have it anymore. And the ACS, they are more like reliable, that are representative to the whole country, started in 2005. So from 2005 until now, every year, we have this information about migration being asked in the ACS, but about residents exactly 1 year before, okay? And this is the kind of information that's publicly available for us. We can get this information about place of residence 1 year before in the EPUMS website, that ipums.org website that's organized by the Minnesota Population Center. And in that public available data, we know which is the area where the person lived before. But since this is public available data, we don't know exactly the county where the person lived. We know what is called the PUMA, P-U-M-A, the public use microdata area. Because if we had public available data in which we identify the person, where the person is living right now, the county, and where the person was living before, in which county, we maybe would be able to identify the person who answered the questionnaire. So it would we would have issues of confidentiality. As a way to deal with that, the Census Bureau, for counties that are small, they group these counties and create this new area, this new geographical area called PUMAs, right? So when you look at public available data from EPUMs, you know the PUMA where the person lived 1 year ago, not the county. And on the other hand, some counties that are really big in terms of population, like LA, they subdivide the county in several PUMAs. So the PUMAs usually have around 100,000 people. And so we know where the PUMA where the person lives right now and the PUMA where the person lived before. And the PUMA is just these areas that are public, areas that are public available for us, and it's more difficult for us to identify specific people in this data. But if you look at the original data from the Census Bureau, you can get information about the county where the person lives now and the county where the person lives before. And for some years in some areas, we can even have the block group that the person lived before, right? Another important source of data that we can estimate internal migration in the US is administrative data, because it's collected every year by the government. It's actually collected for the whole, or at least should be for the whole population, or like a bigger sample, because it's not a sample of the population intentionally like the ACS. It's everybody who submit their income tax form. So the Internal Revenue Service tax returns data allows us to see the migration patterns also from 1 year to the other to where the people were living. And in that case, the date of reference, or at least the date in which we submit usually the income taxes on April 15. But the issue with this data is that it's not public available. You have to be an employee at the IRS to have access of this data, or also there are several researchers within the Census Bureau that submit projects, proposals to the IRS, and then they are able to analyze data from the IRS within the Census Bureau, and they can link IRS data into ACS data. And here I already mentioned to you that Texas A&M, it's one of the universities in the country that has a research data center that has restricted data from the Census Bureau. So we can have here at A&M access to the restricted data from ACS that allows us to know not only the PUMA, but also the county of residence 1 year ago. We have to submit a proposal to the Census Bureau, pass through a background check, and then we can access the restricted data from ACS. But we still cannot access the data from IRS. In order to access data from the IRS, if I'm not a Census Bureau employee, I have to make a partnership with someone within the Census Bureau. That person will be part of my research project, and then we can request IRS data, right? So it's just to show how migration data is more complicated to get at the refined geographical level, right? It's not so straightforward as we think for fertility and mortality. I think my video stopped there, it's frozen. Can you guys from home still, I just moved from with a slide with the title ACS and IRS migration data. Can you see that? Can you guys from home hear me? Okay, thank you, thanks. Thank you. So in this slide here, I just got this table from this article. Matt Hauer, he's an assistant professor at Florida State University in the Sociology department. And he got the IRS data that deals with migration. He organized that data and made it available to to everybody who wants to analyze that data. But in this table here, he kind of summarizes the differences between ACS and IRS data. ACS has more detailed information about socioeconomic and demographic characteristics of the population. So we know the relationship of each person with the head of the household. We know the household type, if the household is rented or if it's owned. We know the age, sex, race, ethnicity, and income, and series of other variables that are collected with the long questionnaire of ACS. And this questionnaire of ACS used to be the long questionnaire on decennial census up to 2000. So this questionnaire from ACS collects all this more detailed information. So it is about migration, but also about age, sex, race, ethnicity, income, and so on. But the sample, it's a sample of US households, and this sample usually covers or selects 2 million households per year. And right now, the ACS actually have data up to 2019. So the ACS covers the period from 2005 to 2019. So it's not only 2016 anymore. But the same thing about the IRS, because this is data that was published in his article here. IRS data has many more observations than ACS. So we have information about around 116 million households, or more than 116 million households every year. Because it's the universe of tax-feeding households, so we usually get more people providing information. And when we enter the information in our income tax forms, we mention our address. And our address, of course, has the city and state where we are, and it has our social security number or the tax information number for those who don't have social security and still file income tax. So with that information, we can actually link the same people over time because we have this identification number, social security number or tax identification number. And we have data covering from 1990 until now. And it's also collected in every year. Oh, and by the way, here on ACS, in this table, he mentions that the time period is a 5-year average, because you can get ACS for every year, 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, 19, all separated for every year. But if you break the population by specific subgroups, considering their characteristics of social demographic variables, if you break the population too much, and because the sample is not big enough, you have to actually merge some years of ACS together. So usually if you are breaking the population by several social demographic characteristics and trying to understand migration, it's better to merge ACS every 5 ACS. So usually work with 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 all together from 2005 to 2009, right? From 2010 to 2014 and so on. IRS data, since we have such a big sample of households, we do not have to group them for a group of years. And also because that's the limitation of IRS data. When we fill out the forms in IRS, we do not provide all this detailed information here about ourselves and other people in our household. There is no demographic characteristics collected there. So actually we cannot break down this sample by specific characteristics of people, right? So there are pros and cons. IRS has a bigger sample size and actually covers a longer period than ACS since 1990 compared to 2005. ACS has a smaller sample size, but it allows you to break the population by all these different characteristics. But if you break them down by several different characteristics, you cannot use data for every year separated. You usually use 5-year averages, okay? And the migration status, whether someone is considered a migrant or not, and in this case here we are focusing on internal migration, we can estimate it with several different ways. We can base the information about the migration status on the state of birth of the person. Maybe I'm just interested in migration across state lines. So I would just use state of birth. Or if I want to know more refined migration flows from one county to the other, or if I'm using public available data from one PUMA to the other, I use the place of residence at the enumeration date, at the enumeration time, and I compare it to the place of residence 1 year before the ACS or 5 years before the census, depending on what I'm analyzing. Right? So usually, if I know that a person is now living in Texas, if that person tells me that he or she was born in California, I can, in that case, mention that that person is a internal migrant from California to Texas. But if that person is in College Station and says that that person was born in Texas, that person is not going to be an internal migrant. But let's say that that same person that told me that he or she was born in Texas is now in College Station, but 1 year before the ACS was in California, if I use this information here, then that person is going to be considered an internal migrant. So depending on the question that I have, I will classify people in different ways. So I have to be really clear about which variable I'm using when I'm classifying people as internal migrants or as non-migrants, okay? For example, these are some examples here. I can say that someone that lives in a specific state and is born in that state, it's considered a non-migrant or a native. And someone who is living in a given state, but was born somewhere else, maybe that person I can classify as being a lifetime migrant. Or born in a given state, but live in some other state, the same thing. So we're crossing state lines. And these people are usually, I'm capturing more this, what I'm calling here, these lifetime migrants, people who were born in a specific state and now live somewhere else. And that person, I'm saying, okay, that person is a lifetime migrant. But I can refine this information by also estimating this other subgroup of recent migrants. People who moved into the state of current residence within this past 5 years, if I'm using census data, or within this last year, if I'm using ACS data. So the way that I categorize people goes from the bottom to the top in this example. I first look here, is there someone there that moved from one state to the other in this last year, if I'm using ACS? If yes, that person will be a recent internal migrant. If not, if the person at least was born in another state and now is living somewhere else, that person is going to be considered a lifetime migrant. If not to both of those, that person is going to be a non-migrant. Usually, in my case, when I'm analyzing internal migration in the US, I pretty much just use these two questions here. I do not use state of birth. I just compare the place where the person is living right now and where the person lived before. If I'm using public available data, I use the PUMA of residence, the public use microdata area. If I'm using restricted data from the census, I can go to the county level. But using only these two questions here, these two sets of information there, I can say that someone is an internal migrant or a non-migrant. I usually do not care that much about these lifetime migrants because I'm trying to understand recent flows. So that all depends on your research question. My research question, I'm usually trying to understand recent flows within the last year based on ACS data. So I either classify people as being internal migrants with this logic or non-migrants. And the non-migrants in this case are people who were living in the same place at the time of ACS and 1 year ago, right? And the recent migrants are people who were living in a different place in the last year compared to where they are now. And in that case, I don't even care if it's in another state, right? So just to show you that there are so many different ways to estimate what internal migrants are. We have to be cautious about with migration data because people could have moved from and back a state several times between birth and the time of the enumeration. So this classification here of lifetime migrants, we might be losing a lot of movements that people did throughout their lives. The same caution applies to measure migration 5 years prior to the enumeration date. Even when you use information about a fixed a place of residence at a fixed date in the past, even here, people can they can report wrong information by mistake, but also I can maybe know where they were living 5 years before the census, but maybe that person moved somewhere else within these 5 years, and that information in between of these migrations between these 5 years is lost from our data, right? So if you're talking about the lifetime migrants and migration within 5 years, we might lose some of the movement between these two time points. These are some examples of rates that we can estimate in migration. In-migration rate, out-migration rate, net migration, gross migration rate, and migration efficiency ratio. I already mentioned those rates to you before. But let's just think a little bit about the in-migration rate and the out-migration rate. What is a rate when we're talking in demographic terms? What's the correct information that should be included in the denominator of rates? The denominator of rates in demography is the number of person years that people live within a specific time interval in which they were exposed to the chance of experiencing the event that's being measured in the numerator. This number of person years is usually hard to calculate because we just get information usually from one time point. A way to approximate the information in the denominator in rates in demography is just get the population in the middle of the year. The population in the middle of the year is an approximation for person years. And what is exactly this number? This is the number of people that were exposed to the risk of experiencing the event that's being measured in the numerator. When I estimate in-migration rates and out-migration rates, what are the denominators of those formulas? The in-migration rate, you are in the place of destination. Let's say that I'm in College Station. And the number of in-migrants in the numerator are the people who moved to College Station. Let's say that I'm using the 2019 ACS. The people who moved to College Station between 2018 and 2019. And what's the denominator of this formula when we are talking about in-migration rate? Is the population in College Station at the end of the period. Right? Or you could even say, oh, it's the population in College Station, the middle of the period. Let's just get the middle of the period here. What is the out-migration rate? Let's say that I'm doing the opposite. I want to know everybody who left college station from 2018 to 19. How do I do that? I just look on ACS, everybody who in 2019 is somewhere else, not in college station, but they were in college station exactly 1 year ago in 2018. And now in 2019, they're somewhere else using the latest ACS. The denominator of that formula, what's going to be? The population in college station in the middle of the period. Between 2018 and 19, what was the population in college station here, and how many people left? Here, the population in the middle of the period in college station, how many people entered? Based on the information that I just gave to you about what's the correct denominator of demographic rates, which one of those here, in-migration rate or out-migration rate, is more appropriate in demographic terms? It's the out-migration rate, right? Because what is the out-migration rate in my example? People who were in college station and were at risk of leaving college station and going somewhere else in the country. What is the in-migration rate? People in the numerator has people who enter college station, and the denominator are people, all the people who were already in college station. The people who are already in college station, the denominator, are not at risk of going to the numerator. So the in-migration rate, it's not an appropriate rate in demographic terms because of that. Because the people in the denominator, the people who are in the destination, are not at risk of going to the destination because they are already there, right? But there are some studies that want to understand the inflow of people to certain areas, taking into account the size of the population, the destination. Maybe that's an important information for policymakers. I want to know, as a policymaker, how many people are entering college station in relation to the population in college station. So in that case, the in-migration rate, although might not be the proper demographic rate to be estimated, it's important, right? But it's just to explain how actually the out-migration rate is the more appropriate rate when we compare these two. Net migration is when we subtract in migrants minus out migrants for a specific area and divided by the population of that area. The net migration rate can be positive if this number is bigger than this, can be negative if out migration is, we have more out migrants than in migrants, or it can be close to zero if these two numbers are similar. When these two numbers are similar, we might have this wrong impression that there is no movement in and out of a specific area. So the gross migration rate could be useful. That tells us the overall movement of people in and out of that area. And the migration efficiency ratio is pretty much the net migration rate divided by the gross migration rate. And the migration efficiency ratio is usually reported in percentage terms, not in 1,000, okay? So that's some examples of rates, and we had already talked about them, and I wanted to make this differentiation between in and out migration rates. Those symbols are the ones that I mentioned. The I means in migrants, O out migrants, and P is the denominator. And demographers use the resident population as a denominator to calculate migration rates. And in this sense, the out migration rates makes more sense because it's people leaving a specific area. People who live in an area are exposed to the risk of getting out of that area. Out migration rate is analogous to the crude death rate in the sense that we are measuring the loss of population in a specific area. Here, in migration rates is analogous to the crude birth rate. because we are talking about gaining in population. Here we are talking people dying. Here we are talking people moving out. Here we are talking about people being born and people moving in. And the net migration rate, which is in migrants minus out migrants, is analogous to the rate of natural increase and decrease, which is pretty much the crude birth rate minus the crude death rate. This is an example of state-to-state domestic migration. This table here is available, it's reported in our textbook. And in this case, it's based on the state of residence 1 year before 2005. So it used data from 2005 ACS, and then it got information about the state where the person lived exactly 1 year ago in 2004. And this is data for California, Nevada, New York, and Texas. And this is the overall number of people who entered California between 2004 and 2005, who entered each one of these states, who left. This number plus this number is the number of gross migrants. This number minus this number, net migrants. So California has been losing more people than receiving, according to data from 2005 ACS that gets this migration from 2004 to 2005. And Texas, for example, has been receiving more people than losing. So net migration is positive. And then we can estimate the rates. The in migrants, we get this number, divided by the population in California, multiplied by 1,000, and the same ones for each one of these states to get the in-migration rate. Out-migration rates, which makes more sense in demographic terms, is this number of out-migrants divided by the population in California, multiplied by 1,000. The gross migration rate, this number here, divided by the population in California, multiplied by 1,000. Net migrants, same thing. This one divided by population in California, divided by 1,000. And then the migration efficiency ratio, we get the number of net migrants divided by the gross migrants and then multiply by 100. So I'm just following this exactly. This is an example of these rates that were shown on slide 33, okay? So with like really simple data in this case, we can see that California and New York have been losing more people, and Texas and Nevada have been gaining more people because like net migration rate is positive. But if you just look at the absolute data, you'd see, wow, Texas is getting more than 120,000 people in balance with the net migration. Nevada is also positive, but it's only 26. But then when we take into account the size of the population of Nevada and Texas, the net migration ratio or the net migration rate in Nevada, it's higher than in Texas because the population of Texas is so much bigger in the denominator that this rate is not so big. But when you compare actually net migrants to gross migrants, because Texas, it's receiving but also losing, has so much movement that the migration efficiency ratio is higher in Texas than in Nevada. So just with this really simple exercise, we can already see some differences in migration levels and patterns across these states. And these are just 4 states as an example here, just for this specific year. And now we enter on this portion of the chapter related to history, a little bit of a history of domestic migration in the US. So let's talk a little bit about the overall trends and levels of internal migration in the US. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, there were steadily stream of migration set in the western areas beyond the Mississippi River, so people moving west. And between the late 1800s and 1960s, the South has been the major exporter of people. So a lot of people leaving the South and going to the northern areas of the US, both Northeast and also Northwest. But now, more recently, since the 1970s, the major interregional migration flows within the US have been from east to west and from north to south, right? So there is this shifty movement. People, and we're going to talk about the Great Migration, African Americans getting out of southern areas in which they didn't have good opportunities, a lot of prejudice and racism. People left southern areas, but in more recent decades, we see an opposite trend. And here, when we're talking about these regional flows, just to be clear which regions we are talking about the Northeast, these states, the South, Midwest, West, and Pacific, including Alaska and Hawaii. So those graphs that I'm going to show you here with trends of internal migration in the US or inter-regional migration, as I mentioned here before, it's between those 5 areas: West, Midwest, Northeast, South, and Pacific, okay? For every 5-year period between 1970 and 2010, the South has been the only region to have continuously experienced positive net migration. So the southern states here, they have been receiving more people than losing people since 1970. The West region has moved from positive to negative in 1995 and to slightly positive in 2010. So it was positive, net migration, then slightly negative, and now attracting more people than losing again. And the South and West were popular destinations, particularly among graduate degree holders who are 25 years old and older. So it's pretty much people with a graduate degree moving usually with higher chances to Western states and Southern states looking for jobs after they graduate. And the Midwest and Northeast regions have continuously had negative net migration since the 1970s. So Midwest and Northeast losing more people than gaining people. And this slide here in words is just explaining this slide here with this graph. So just showing that the South has been experiencing more people entering this region than losing. So all these numbers here are above 0. So this is net migration based on 5-year domestic net migration by region. Why 5-year domestic net migration? This is based on, this is data based on census. It's not only census data, because 2005 and 2010, I'm not really sure exactly, because it's 5-year domestic net migration. From 70, 80, 90, 2000 is from census data. For the other years, I don't know exactly where they got this data from, but you see from 1970 to 2010, the southern states are receiving more people than losing. Western states also had a positive net migration, became negative in 1995, below 0 in 1995, and slightly positive in more recent years. And Midwest and Northeast, they have been losing more people, so below 0. And it got really negative in the 80s. That's when people really start to leave those areas, the Northeast and also the Midwest in 1985. But now they have been, the net migration has not been so negative, so strongly negative as before. But this graph here is pretty much explained in this previous slide. And as I mentioned, the Great Migration has been a major migration, a historical migration flow that demographers, geographers, historians have been analyzing is that during the Great Migration in these years of 1910 and 1970, over 6 million African Americans moved out of the rural South to the Midwest, Northeast, and to the Pacific coast. Just to give you an idea, in 1900, almost 90% of African Americans were living in southern states. By 1970, the states of New York, Illinois, and California had received large numbers of African Americans exactly because of this Great Migration. The interesting thing about there are some recent papers talking about the Great Migration that recently the Census Bureau linked data of historical census into more recent surveys. So we can know whether people who migrated from the rural South in 1930s and 1940s, where their children are in more recent years. And a lot of these papers that are being published just now in 2019 and 2020 show that the children of African Americans who moved from the rural South in the 1930s and 1940s and moved to the Northeast of the US, for example, these children nowadays, they have better educational and socioeconomic outcomes than the children of African Americans who stayed back in the South. Right? So this Great Migration, it's still being analyzed today because now you have more refined data. What is this kind of data? That now we can link people using information from 1930 and 1940 census into recent ACS. So we have longitudinal data. We can link information about migration of parents and grandparents to the people nowadays, right? And kind of showing that African Americans who moved from the South to the Northeast, their children and grandchildren got better education, have better earnings compared to those that stayed back behind, right? So this is a great topic of research, and some really interesting papers were published in these last 2 years. In this other paper that's also out of the textbook, the African-American Great Migration from the South to the North happened during the 20th century. African Americans were seeking better socioeconomic opportunities for their families. This migration contributed to social, economic, demographic, and cultural transformations in northern cities. The areas of destination changed because of this internal migration flow. And this is just to give an idea of African Americans living in non-southern areas. This is the total, the columns here in gray is the total number of African Americans living outside of the southern states. So it increased a lot from below 1 million to more than 12 million. And if you just look at the trend of people, of African Americans who were born in southern areas, but now are living somewhere else, that's the black line here. So it really increased in this last decade and tend to stabilize a little bit more. So this line here are people who were born in southern states and moved away. And the column includes those people, but also includes their children and grandchildren, right? So just to show how that was significant change in absolute terms in the US in these last decades. This is a map that I also got from outside of the textbook to show the main flows, the main migration corridors of the Great Migration between 1916 and 1930. So the yellow people going from southeast to the northeast areas, states and cities, and the cities here are highlighted the cities that they were the main destination areas. From South Central to Midwest, and from Southwest to Midwest, and also to Far West, right? So just to show you that this migration happened between several states in the country. And even in more recent decades, a little bit, so this one is for 1916 to 1930, this one from 1940 to 1970, you see more flows being added. And before here, you didn't have a significant flow going northwest, but then in more recent decades, going to Seattle and Portland, for example. And also the destination cities here, they vary a little bit more as well, right? So like here actually in more recent years in this map, they highlight also the origin cities as well. Also, oh, that's old story, but the migration of African Americans throughout these decades, if we link information of them to their children and grandchildren that are captured on recent surveys, such as the American Community Survey, we get census data from the 1930s and 40s and linked to recent data, we can analyze whether those children and grandchildren of African Americans that moved here are better off than the children and grandchildren of African Americans who stayed here. And that's the main finding. Yes, the ones who moved, their children and grandchildren are doing better in terms of education attainment and socioeconomic status. But also whites moved to the north in large numbers between 1910 and 1970. However, whites did not experience disadvantaged positions as the African American population was experienced in the South. Prejudice, racism, low paying jobs, lower levels of education, segregation, and so on. Segregation and concentration of poverty also started to be observed in the northern areas where African Americans started to move into. So they got better life by moving from the south to the north, but exactly because they did not have the same opportunities of the white population, they usually were segregated and concentrated in poor areas in northern states. And that limited residential mobility of African Americans. I just mentioned to you that some recent data that we finally can link historical census from 1930 to 1940, that now the data was released, because every 50 years, the more refined data of census are released. So now we have this information from 1930 and 1940 that's able to connect to recent surveys. Those African Americans who moved to the north got better lives than the ones that stayed back behind. But even those ones that moved to the north, they still had limited residential mobility compared to whites. This historical process has to be understood in order to further investigate Black migration and mobility. So we have all this data, really refined data nowadays that lets us to understand it better. But it's important to understand what was going on in the country at that time and what were the reasons behind people deciding to migrate from the south to the north. After the Great Migration, change contributed to the desire by Black inner city residents to relocate to the suburbs and to better neighborhoods within the north. So we start to see some mobility as well. African Americans moved from the south to the north states, and afterwards they try to move into neighborhoods where their children can have access to better school and they can have better life standard. Cross-generation familial and cultural connections contributed for Blacks returning to the South. Although a lot of African Americans moved to the North, some of their parents stayed back in the South. So the links continue. And because of these links continue, pretty much social network, that also in more recent years, you start to see some migration the opposite way, African Americans going back to the South. Only after changes took place in the South towards socioeconomic and political equality for Blacks, return migration became more attractive. Of course, we don't have complete equality, and when we're talking about socioeconomic, political issues, but it's a situation in which they are living better now than what it was 1910, 1920, and 1930s. Okay. After the 1970s, we see a reversal migration. Younger, college-educated migrants moving to more prosperous and post-civil rights South. So some areas in Atlanta, like specific cities, Dallas, Houston, are among the most popular destinations for whites, Blacks, and new immigrant minorities. So all these cities, they have been attracting a lot of this younger, high educated population. And the examples here that's highlighted in the textbook of Atlanta, Dallas, and Houston. Migration varies by a series of social demographic characteristics, and it varies by age. We already saw with the graphs of migration rates by age that it varies a lot. Specific by age, young adults, those between 20 and 29 today, are more likely to move than anyone else. And the reasons are usually related to they are going to start college, or they got a job, so they got an employment, or they are getting married. And those are all reasons, as we saw in those graphs organized by Martin Bell and his colleagues, that increases a lot the chances of people migrating in that parabola, in the curve of people going to college, getting a job, and getting married. And people who are at least 40 years old are much less likely to move. Older people are more likely to stay in a specific area exactly because they already have a more settled life. Migration also varies by education. Highly educated people are more likely to migrate because they have more possibilities of knowing about jobs, and they have the means actually to move from one place to the other. They get more information about job opportunities and about other places that they could have a good lifestyle. The farther they move, the more likely education will play a major role in the decision of moving. If you are talking about migration between counties within the same state, maybe you might see some migration of lower educated people. But when you're talking about migration long distances, usually the chances of seeing migrants with higher education it's higher than people with lower education. Right? Migration also varies by occupation. White-collar workers are the most mobile occupation group, kind of related to exactly education as well. Farm and service workers are the least likely to migrate within the US. Manual workers are more likely to move locally. And people who are not in the labor force are also likely to move, because if someone is unemployed, that person will try to take the risk and move to another place to get a job. So both white-collar workers and unemployed people are more likely to migrate. And we are just looking at what are the factors that influence people to migrate. So the decision to migrate is likely reached when advantages of moving to the destination outweighs the disadvantage, the risks that I will have to take if I stay in the area of origin. And the thing is that we are analyzing what are the characteristics of people that migrated, that are more likely to migrate by age, by education, and by occupation. And these people, they influence the areas of destination where they're moving to, but they also influence the area of the origin where they left, because the areas of origin will change their population composition because of losing these people. So population movements, either small or large, have effects both of the place on the places of origin and destination. they affect in-migrants and non-migrants, right? When we talk about international migration, we see that more clearly because we see that areas that receive a lot of inflows of international migrants, we see changes in food availability and other styles of culture coming in. But even with internal migration, we also experience that. A really clear case is, for example, Austin. Austin in these last years has been receiving a lot of internal migration from other places in the US. And the tech industry in Austin has been increasing a lot. That has been changing completely. For example, downtown Austin, that now you have like all these big apartment buildings. And people were usually tend to live more in suburbs in the past. Now they're moving more towards downtown. And that changes the city. The people changes. It's not just college students or professors from UT Austin, but also all these professionals that are moving to the area. We are also experiencing that here in College Station. I have been here only for a few years, but you already start to see that the city is growing so much, not only because of the college population that also increases the number of undergraduate and graduate students here, but with that, a lot of businesses are moving to College Station, and that changes the composition of the city. And we are talking here only about internal migration, right? And the effect of moving for an individual differs from the effect of an aggregate migration population. So for an individual, usually that individual is looking for better educational opportunities for their children, for themselves, better job opportunities. And that dynamic affects both the areas of origin and destination at the aggregate level. So we can do analysis of migration both in terms of the consequences to individuals, but also to the aggregate population. That example that I gave about Great Migration, by linking historical census from the 1930s and 1940s to more recent years, what is that? I'm looking at the effects of migration of parents and grandparents in the past on education and labor market outcomes of children. So I'm looking at effects at the individual or maybe household level. And what about the aggregate? Then I have to look at the overall South, what happened? The overall Northeast, what happened? So I mentioned to you, Northeast, you start to see more areas that increase poverty, but then as African Americans, they start to experiencing mobility in their lifetime, they start to move to suburbs. In that case, I'm looking also at the aggregate level, changes that these internal migration flows cause to the area as a whole. And some more examples here about the effects of individual migration on the individual migrant. A major effect of migration to an individual migrant includes social, economic, political, or physical characteristics of a new environment are more favorable or preferable than those in the previous residence. So there are some characteristics of the area of destination that make people more likely to want to go there. These preferences usually depend on migrants' personal observations and experiences, where the migrant possesses the right skills to adapt to the new area, and where the migrant is readily accepted. So this is related to what I said in the theories of migration, what about Todaro was saying. What is my information that I have about the area of destination? Maybe the area of destination, I will not get much better lifestyle than where I am now. But the information that I have is that I would, that's my perception. So I move to that area. Do I have good training to get the jobs in the area of destination? That will be really important for my decision to move to that area. And if there are no issues of prejudice, racism, or anything in the area of destination, that will also affect my chances to get to improve my life after the migration, my migration movement. In terms of the effects at the aggregate level, the area of origin is affected by the number of type of migrants that are getting out of those areas. A large out-migration will significantly affect an area's potential population growth. That has been really the case of Midwestern areas in the country, and a lot of rural areas in the US losing a lot of population in more recent years. So there is a concern about that. And for example, if the net migration rate is highly negative and the population staying is largely elderly, you might have a less productive population left behind, right? And that might affect the well-being of the whole population there of origin. And when I talk to you here about the example of the Great Migration, I mentioned about African Americans moving to the south, to the north. That will affect their own lives. But in the future, that will also affect the lives of their children and grandchildren. And I show you that graph that was made by Tonley, in which we see the overall number of African Americans who are now living in non-southern areas, both the ones born outside and the ones born in non-southern areas, born in southern areas and born outside. But also in that same graph, we saw the line just showing those that were born in southern areas and now are somewhere else. So that graph is a really clear example of the two ways that in-migration contributes to the increase of population there of destination. We have both the direct effect of the immigrants themselves moving to those areas, but the indirect effect. The direct effect depends on the relative size of migrants compared to the size of the population destination. The indirect effect depends on the fertility levels of these migrants, how many children they have compared to the population. So if you just go back to that graph, just to make it clear, here in the columns, we have the overall African Americans living in non-southern states. This could be the ones that moved to non-southern states and those that are born in non-southern states. So this is both the direct and the indirect effect, the immigrants and their children. And here, this one is just a direct effect. African Americans who were born in southern states, and then they moved to other areas. So the black line here is the direct effect, and the direct migrants, and the columns include both direct and indirect. And the size of these people here compared to the population of destination, you say how much they will influence the area of destination. And if on average they have more children than those people that were already in the area of destination, that will affect population composition, right? So that magnitude depends on the levels of reproductive behavior of migrants compared to the receiving population. This last slide here, we reach 4:30. It's a summary of an interview that this demographer William Frey gave to NPR back in 2019. I will go back to this here, but if you want, in the course website, if you go to this link here, you can hear his interview. It's really short. You just go to the course website, and then on the portion here about internal migration, internal migration, there is like some other material here of how to estimate migration using all these different software packages. And this one here is the interview of William Frey. And this is an article that he also wrote related to the recent flows of internal migration in the US. So this interview, 5 minutes long, you can listen to it. This is the article that he wrote for the first time on record. Fewer than 10% of Americans moved in a year. And this slide here, I'm just summarizing that. And this interview and this article is before the pandemic. So we should also expect the pandemic to affect these trends. And we're going to discuss this on Tuesday, this coming week. Then I expect to finish internal migration on Tuesday. And we will continue on, we will start the international migration lecture. Okay? So thank you very much. Have a great weekend. And I see you guys on Tuesday.